Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Tanner. I'm the director of Onward, and I have great pleasure in welcoming you to this pre-budget briefing. In just over a week's time, as you will all know, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak will stand at the dispatch box and announce his second budget. And astonishingly, it may be even more historically significant than his first, which, as you'll remember, came just 27 days after he got the job as Chancellor of the Exchequer. In the intervening time, the measures that he announced in that budget have pushed borrowing up to the highest point outside two world wars and hiked debt to nearly 100% of GDP. A kind of tall order to kind of beat the historical significance of that budget, but given the tightrope walk that the Chancellor is going to have to tread, I don't think that's an overstatement. The kind of path ahead of him is fraught with economic uncertainty and political danger. And he said in his party conference speech last year that this government will always balance the books, but we don't yet know exactly what that means. What does it mean in terms of fiscal rules, especially given perhaps a growing acceptance on the international stage that governments have a bit more leeway, a bit more flexibility about debt and borrowing than perhaps they did given low interest rates. How soon should he start introducing measures to meet that commitment to balance the books, given the fragility of the economy right now and fears that any preemptive action could hold back a nascent recovery? And if he does seek to consolidate the fiscal position, how soon should he start introducing measures to meet that commitment? How should he do it? Should he do it through tax cuts? And if so, on whom? Should he do it by reducing public spending? And if so, where? And where will the public allow it? Or should he seek to run the economy a bit hotter and let inflation rise? And if so, where is his appetite and where should it be? And then beyond the fiscal question, there are deep economic questions to be answered too. After 2008, you could argue that the services industries drove the economy. That was great for jobs, arguably very good for London and the South East, but perhaps less so for national productivity levels, perhaps less so for regional economies. Is there a case for a different type of recovery this time around? And if so, what does that mean in practice? What does phrases like building back better or leveling up mean? What type of economy should we seek to foster and create after the pandemic? And is it very different from the one we had before? So today, to answer those questions, and I suspect to get into much more besides, I'm thrilled to introduce a fantastic panel of speakers. I suspect all of whom will be well known to you, but hopefully we can have a discussion which genuinely kind of develops the policy debate and contributes to some of the framing of the Chancellor's budget next week. First, we will hear from Rupert Harrison. Rupert is portfolio manager at BlackRock. He is also, I'm delighted to say, a board member at Onward and a member of the government's Industrial Strategy Council. And he was previously Chief of Staff to George Osborne from 2010 to 2015 and chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Treasury during that time as well. Before that, he was an advisor to David Cameron and George Osborne in opposition and has previously worked for the Institute of Fiscal Affairs as well. So has probably been covering budgets for the last 15 years or so. Second, we will hear from Lizzie Burden. Lizzie is a reporter at Bloomberg covering UK economy, trade, the Treasury and the Bank of England. She was previously a reporter at The Telegraph, where she covered similar issues, kind of business and economic issues, and a presenter of Coronanomics TV as well. And then finally, we will hear from David Gork. David is now head of policy at Macfarlane's. That was the law firm that he was a solicitor at before entering Parliament in 2005. Shortly after that, he became a shadow Treasury Minister. And then when the coalition was formed, he became the minister responsible for tax policy for the tax system, both as Exchequer Secretary and Financial Secretary, before becoming Chief Secretary to the Treasury, to joining the cabinet table, and then after that being promoted to both Secretary of State for Work and Pensions and Secretary of State for Justice and Lord Chancellor. So someone who has experience of basically every role apart from being Chancellor in the Treasury and several senior cabinet roles besides. So that is a fantastic panel. I'm sure we'll get into lots of the deep and knotty questions that the Chancellor is currently grappling with. Before I hand over to Rupert, I just want to make clear 3 core housekeeping rules for today. You should all be familiar with these types of sessions, but just to reiterate, if I could ask my speakers to stay on mute when they're not talking and to unmute themselves when they are. If I could ask anyone listening and zooming in to leave any comments or questions in the Q&A function or indeed the chat function, and I'll make sure to relay them to the speakers during the Q&A session after their opening remarks. And finally, just to be clear, we will finish this session at 2:30 because I'm sure that all of you at home and indeed our speakers on the panel have busy diaries and lots to be getting on with in these turbulent times. So without further ado, I am delighted to hand over to Rupert Harrison. Rupert.
Great, thank you, Will. Very lucky to go first because otherwise I'm sure that David and Lizzie would say everything and I'd be left with nothing. So we'll see what David's got left at the end of 3 intros. I'll just give a quick overview of where I think the economic situation is that Rishi Sunak's facing, and then sort of how he might think about balancing some of the policy requirements coming along. I mean, really, the economy is going to be a sort of tale of 2 halves. We've essentially got a sort of bridge now through to kind of May and June, where we're going to get the sort of full reopening, and we're going to get we've now got that sort of reopening plan set out. And I think that is going to be characterized by a pretty strong bounce back. I think that Andy Haldane had a good phrase where he talked about the economy being like a coiled spring. I think there's quite a lot of truth to that. I think that you're going to get a number of supportive impulses that are going to lead to a bounce back that I think will surprise people to the upside. I think there's part of that is the sort of automatic reopening. You know, you've got an economy that's depressed because there are a lot of things that people can't do. As those things come back on stream, you're just going to get, in terms of quarter-on-quarter growth rates, some very big numbers as that comes back. The second is there's quite a lot of cash sitting out there on the sidelines. Now, this cash is pretty unequally distributed, and Will, I know that Onward and others have been pointing out that there have definitely been some pretty important losers from the pandemic in terms of people who lost their jobs, haven't been able to work from home, suffered from health and other kind of learning consequences. But actually, when you look at households on average, and that's what matters for the kind of macro economy as opposed to micro policy, when you look at the average, actually most households are sitting on more cash than they had before. We've had a bigger jump in the savings rate. People have been, having largely their incomes maintained at or close to what they were before, and there have been a lot of things they haven't been able to spend money on. Now, not all of that money will be spent straight away. Some of it is already being used for things like buying houses, cars, etc. But some of it will be saved. But I think that cash, a large part of it will be spent. And I think that there will also be a kind of behavioral need to sort of spend money on all the things we haven't been able to spend money on. Certainly, we've been having quite a few conversations in my household about holidays over the last 24 hours. I'm sure lots of other people have. And then finally, we've got fiscal and monetary support in very large scale, not just in the UK, but around the world. So we've got, central banks continuing to buy huge amounts of assets, pumping liquidity into the system, keeping interest rates very low. We've got governments spending a lot of money, including the UK government, on things like the furlough scheme, but also ramping up spending elsewhere on training support, also capital spending and infrastructure spending. And that is true around the world, particularly in the US. The US has already had an incredibly large fiscal stimulus, and we're about to get another very, very big one, to the extent that even people like Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard are wondering about whether it's too much. And in my book, if Larry Summers says you might be doing too much, then you're probably doing too much. But we shall see. So all of those things, I think, are going to contribute to a kind of global bounce back. And I think the UK is pretty well positioned to benefit from that, particularly where we are in the vaccination progress. Obviously, at the same time, there is some scarring, there is some unemployment. We've already seen jobs lost. Some of that is temporary, and we've seen in other countries, as you've seen opening up, that those temporary job losses can be reabsorbed pretty quickly. But some of it is permanent, and that's because I think the pandemic has accelerated some pretty big structural changes that were happening anyway. We can all see that in terms of the move to online business models. We can see that in people working from home, physically located differently. So there's a sort of immediate reshaping of the service economy needed around people's new locations and new habits. And now some of that will go back to normal, but I suspect not all of it. And there are some kind of other underlying changes in the energy sector, the whole net zero transition and other things. So there is going to be the need for, you know, reallocation of some people who've lost their jobs, and we know that can be painful and difficult and that people need support. But I think that the overall macro picture will be one of very strong bounce back. And we also know that the UK economy over the last decade, where it has been a star performer, even if it's been weaker in things like productivity growth, has been a star performer in terms of job creation, and particularly job creation in those sectors which have been particularly hard hit by the pandemic. So I feel optimistic that we will be able to create jobs on the way back. So what's the challenge therefore for Rishi Sunak? I think that the challenge is twofold. One is to sort of continue that support as that bridge between now and May to June, to phase out things like the furlough scheme, which have been incredibly important. I mean, it's a big innovation for the UK. I think all credit to the Treasury for getting it up and running. Largely, I think, thanks to many of the things that David put in place in terms of real-time information and the sort of improvements to the PAYE system and all the things that have been required to make this work. And he's too modest to take credit for that, so I'll give it to him. But that has been incredibly important. That does need to be phased out. It's a very big distortion. The furlough scheme is paying people not to work. So we want to transition to a situation where people are incentivized to work again, but certainly by June. And so I think we've seen the way the Treasury will think about that. We're going to transition back sort of through something that looks more like a kind of job subsidy scheme and phasing out that support from the furlough. But I think he has to do that gradually to make sure you don't get a kind of big spike in unemployment. Then continuing this to spend the other short-term things around job creation, training, and continuing to ramp up that spending on infrastructure and other capital investment. And obviously, my personal view is that starting with Sajid Javid now, and even before that, we now have a very ambitious capital spending program from the government, and I suspect the challenge there is going to be getting the money out the door rather than increasing budgets on paper, because it's really a lack of capacity in these big infrastructure sectors that is now limiting the scale and the speed at which you can do these things. But those are obviously longer term, very important projects, very important from a macro point of view to have that capital spending support for the economy, but also very important for some of the micro policy priorities the government has around productivity growth, particularly levelling up, and industrial policy, which is kind of close to my heart as a member of the Industrial Strategy Council. So he's got to sort of continue those support, but he has also got to marry that with what the difficult bit is, which is what's the fiscal plan. And that, of course, is always the most difficult judgment in any budget and the most difficult judgment for any chancellor. I think that my bottom line is we're in a very different world to where we were before. Central banks have crossed an important Rubicon over the last year. They are sort of de facto or either implicitly or explicitly essentially guaranteeing yield curves. I mean, we've seen some pretty dramatic moves in yield curves actually in markets over the last week or two, but we're still within pretty narrow ranges. And I think that we are in a sort of lower for longer rates environment. And so we know now that I think that in that environment, countries can sustain higher levels of debt than they could before. Personally think we need to sort of focus a whole fiscal debate around sort of forecasts for debt interest service costs, because of debt service costs are actually lower than they were before because of the incredibly low yields we have in government bond markets. And sort of forecasts for debt interest, I think, are a much more useful anchor for fiscal policy, particularly if you've got an independent forecaster like the OBR to make that forecast, than a kind of absolute level of debt, which I think we just have to acknowledge we have to be, and I think can safely be, carrying higher levels of debt than before. One implication of that I think is the UK is a beneficiary of is we have very long maturity debt. So on average, the average sort of period of the maturity of the bonds that we issue into the market is much longer than most countries. Why is that important? It's important because the main vulnerability for all countries, I think, going forward with these high levels of debt will be, what if we do get inflation coming back? What if we do get interest rates rising faster than expected from these very low levels? May not be likely, but that's clearly the risk. And then you're much more vulnerable to that change if you've got to refinance your debt regularly at those new higher rates. Whereas if you've got an average of long maturity debt that we have, then you've got a longer period of time to adjust to that new normal. And I think most developed countries need to do more in that space to insulate insulate themselves from this risk of higher rates, particularly the US, which has traditionally issued much shorter maturity, has benefited from being the global reserve currency, and I think there is increasing talk in the US about longer duration bonds, longer maturity bonds to be issued. So I think that we don't need to panic, but I think there is a problem. So just sort of finally wrap up, the OBR are clearly going to forecast something like a 40 billion hole in terms of the kind of structural current budget deficit is left after the recovery. I suspect it might be smaller than that, because I think the recovery is going to be more vigorous than they will pencil in, but there clearly is a hole. And I think it probably is a good idea for Rishi Sunak to use this window now to at least set out a plan to fill that hole. Now, of course, very different about setting out a plan compared to when those measures actually kick in. I think for this year, at least, you want to be continuing the fiscal support in order to boost the economy, to help those jobs get reabsorbed, to help smooth over any of the kind of permanent scarring and damage that's been done this year, probably into next year. But I think, there are sort of political and good economic reasons to think, okay, well, that there is a hole. I think it's kind of credible and honest to set out how you think you're going to try and fill it. I think we clearly are going to hear about tax rises as part of that. I think it'll be interesting to see what the mix is. I mean, actually, when last time Rishi Sunak stood up and published some fiscal numbers, implicit in those numbers is a continuing pretty tight squeeze on current day-to-day government spending. I mean, there's a lot of focus on the very big increases in capital spending that we've got coming down the road, but actually the government doesn't have a huge amount of leeway when it comes to current spending priorities, and I think that will remain the case for the foreseeable future. So I think that will continue to play a part of the story. I think that tax clearly will have to be the most sort of politically controversial part of the story. We've seen stories, for good or ill, the manifesto has ruled out, the big taxes. And so I think we will see some combination of increases in corporation tax. David may disagree. I personally think that's fine. I always thought there was kind of diminishing returns to cutting corporation tax once you got into the sort of low 20s. So I don't think an increase in UK corporation tax is a big problem. Probably a sensible place to get some money. I think, freezing freezing personal allowances, thresholds, I'm sure that will happen. The great advantage of that as well is that it gets the money in gradually over time, so not all up front. And then I think, we can talk, I was sort of out of time, but we can talk about some of the more difficult choices around things like capital gains tax, fuel duty. These are all going to be politically and economically fraught areas. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Rupert. That was an amazing kind of course through lots of different aspects of the challenges facing the Chancellor, and lots for us to pick up on, not least your question of tax rises and where they should fall in the discussion afterwards. Just before I hand over to Lizzie, just to remind people to put questions and comments in the Q&A and chat function, just to ensure that I have time to get to them in the Q&A. But I'm delighted now to hand over to Lizzie Burden.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks very much for having me with you today. It's really an honour to be here with not one, not two, but three people who've been so closely involved with shaping budgets and fiscal events in the past. So as a lowly onlooker, I'll be reporting on the budget as part of the UK economy team at Bloomberg. So I thought I'd share some thoughts on what we're expecting, what we're hearing from economists, think tanks, business groups and unions, and the considerations surrounding those options in the Chancellor's toolkit. Even though this is only Rishi Sunak's second budget, I think it's important to note that there have been 13 major fiscal announcements since his last one in March last year, and they've involved more than £250 billion of extra spending. And the pandemic has also forced him to expand the role of the state in ways unimaginable when he became Chancellor a year ago. Now, after those 3 national lockdowns, which are still in, we hopefully have a workable roadmap back to normality, boosted by the vaccine programme that's given a much needed injection of optimism into the economic recovery, along with massive monetary and fiscal support around the world. But there does remain a lot of uncertainty characterised by 2 big unknowns. First, we don't know how many jobs that have been furloughed will end up being lost. And second, we don't know how much people who are lucky enough to have been able to save will actually go on to spend those savings, whether people will go for it as Rupert thinks and the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey hopes, But of course, many economists are much more cautious, remembering Andy Haldane's forecast of a V-shaped recovery last year actually turned out to be more like a W. So it's not obvious yet when the government will be able to capitalise on its vaccine success or how badly the pandemic will scar the economy. But it is expected that Britain will have to live with higher levels of unemployment and government borrowing for years to come. Now, turning to the choices that the Chancellor faces at the budget, the first is how to deal with the immediate crisis. Yesterday, the Prime Minister promised not to pull the rug out from jobs and livelihoods for the duration of the pandemic, and Rishi Sunak himself is committed to doing whatever it takes. So the furlough scheme, first of all, has worked well so far. It's kept joblessness contained, well below predictions at the start of the pandemic. And with business united on the need to extend the scheme, the Chancellor is expected to listen to that. But ultimately, it's paying people to be at home, and the economy is about to start reopening. So where the debate really comes in is how long it should be extended for. Unions are asking for an extension to the end of the year, but there's talk about a gradual phasing out. There could be support on new jobs, particular regions, sectors that have been harder hit by restrictions. The next thing I want to talk about is universal credit, and we're thinking whether the Chancellor will extend the £20 a week uplift to the welfare payment. The Work and Pensions Committee said that he should reject proposals to pay a one-time bonus instead of granting an extension. And the committee's chairman's warned that hundreds of thousands of people would be swept into poverty or even destitution without that extension. So again, the question really is how long the extension will be. And some lobby groups are asking for a whole other year. There's also been a lot of speculation around the extension of a stamp duty holiday past the March 31st deadline to keep propping up the housing market. There are fears that a simple extension could create another cliff edge down the line. So the Centre for Policy Studies has called for the holiday to be left in place, but some Treasury officials have warned that that would take away the holiday effect of the policy. At the other extreme, the holidays fueled the market just as it was intended to. It's helped protect jobs in the industry, but that increase in house prices has also made homes even more out of reach for first-time buyers. So some estate agents are calling for a compromise where the holiday would only be extended for properties that are already under offer, because we know there's a whole pipeline of properties that are going to miss the tax deadline and get a surprise tax bill. So a hybrid option would be to just extend it for those buyers, but maintain a fixed date for the rest of the market. Obviously, all of this costs. I've not talked about half the stuff that Rishi Sunak could do for the economy, and the budget deficit's already setting peacetime records, as we've mentioned. But the question is when to pay for it all. Most economists I've spoken to agree that a premature fiscal tightening would only serve to abort the recovery. And it's not as though there's great market pressure with debt interest rates so low. You've even got some people arguing that raising taxes won't be necessary to repair the public finances if there's a strong enough economic rebound. And Philip Hammond's in that camp. But despite what Philip Hammond or economists say, Rishi Sunak's under pretty intense political pressure to show he's responsible on that front, especially with Keir Starmer attempting to rehabilitate Labour's image on that front. So even if it's too early to raise taxes, it doesn't stop Rishi Sunak talking about it. And the signals out of the Treasury are that he's going to delay any major tax rises till the autumn and focus next week on that COVID support I was talking about. Which brings me on to how to pay for it all. There's clearly very little room to squeeze any more out of public spending, given how much it's already been squeezed over the past decade, given the aging population, and given how the pandemic's actually raised expectations within the public for how much should be put back, for example, into the NHS and social care, which leaves us with higher taxes. Now, the Conservatives' election promise before the pandemic that they wouldn't raise income tax, VAT or national insurance, the three biggest revenue generators, has kind of tied the Chancellor's hands somewhat in this post-pandemic context. So the easiest political win that Rupert mentioned is a lift in corporation tax, or to signal a lift in corporation tax. Again, we've heard from Rupert, I don't know if that would be very popular with David, given he was around when George Osborne cut corporation tax to boost investment and to show that Britain was open for business. And when more does Britain need to show that it's open for business than in a pandemic post-Brexit? And there's always speculation that Rishi Sunak will carry on with that thinking and cut the tax even further to create some sort of Singapore on Thames. But I think what we're realistically expecting is an increase from 19 to 23% by the time of the next election, which is expected to raise £12 billion a year. And the Chancellor himself has argued that there's little evidence that lower corporation tax significantly drives inward investment. So I'm interested in where David comes in on that debate in this new economic climate. Obviously, a corporation tax rise is the last thing that business wants now, but I think what's also important is the international context. 23% would fall below the OECD average of 23.5%. And when you've still got debates going on about a global minimum tax rate led by the OECD, the idea of tampering with corporation tax at home seems a bit premature right now. Another related politically easy option would be to equalise the rate of capital gains tax with taxpayers' income tax bands, and that idea was suggested by the Office of Tax Simplification last year. And it would essentially mean that founders face higher tax bills when they sell a company or shares. It's expected to raise about £14 billion. Now, left-leaning think tanks like the IPPR say that that policy would be fairer and simpler, but very few people are expecting this to actually happen given the opposition from leading Tory donors. And you have to think about what sort of signal that sort of reform would send to entrepreneurs and potential investors in post-Brexit Britain on top of a corporation tax hike. As I say, the Chancellor's unlikely to touch the heavy lifting taxes, so he's left with options around the edges, but I'm sure we'll go into a lot more detail about that in the Q&A. So some overall takeaways. First of all, in all of this, the Chancellor will have in mind the government's three main long-term targets: net zero carbon by 2050, levelling up the regions, and creating a prosperous global Britain. Those are going to guide the Chancellor's thinking, but hopefully they'll be balanced with the recovery effort. For example, you'd think that raising fuel duty would be a no-brainer, but rising global oil prices through the crisis have meant that fuel prices have had 14 straight weeks of rises at the pumps, and it's really not the time to be hitting the haulage industry when it's already burdened with a slew of Brexit paperwork. Secondly, business wants clarity. Long-term reform, for example, on business rates has been postponed to the autumn so that the Treasury can develop a coherent long-term strategy. But lobby groups say that there's also a cost to delaying that decision and that it could lead to unnecessary job losses. So wherever possible, the Chancellor should be clear about what lies ahead so that businesses can plan. And finally, if we've learned anything in the past year of pandemic spending, I think it's that spending needs to be done smartly, not wastefully, and there needs to be joined up thinking in government. The Eat Out to Help Out scheme last summer with the half-price meals really didn't add up with what other governments were planning, knowing that a second wave was probably around the corner, and the government's own advisors ended up calling it epidemiologically illiterate. So I think even the man in the street whose eyes glaze over at some of the details of all of this understands that very, very simple lesson. But that's enough for me. I'll hand over to David and look forward to the Q&A.
Lizzie, thank you so much. That was brilliant and obviously covered off a lot of ground as well. David, over to you. You've been kind of sitting on the other side of the fence thinking about budgets in years gone by, but you're now kind of looking in, probably not enviably or kind of envying the Chancellor for some of the decisions that he's about to make. What's your take on the kind of core challenge in front of him and how he should respond?
Well, thanks, Will. And I'm conscious that we're at the stage of today's event where almost everything's been said, but not everybody has yet said it. So I will try and pick up on some of the themes that Rupert and Lizzie have outlined already. I think in a way it's worth thinking of the budget with three tasks for the Chancellor, which is short term, medium term and longer term. And when I say short term, these circumstances really short term of just how do we continue to provide support for businesses over the next few weeks as we ease out of the lockdown? That's relatively straightforward, and I assume he will largely extend some of the existing measures and things like furloughing and business rates relief and VAT in certain sectors. There's a medium-term challenge, which is about how do you get us away from the exceptional support and move us on to something which is looking at the post-lockdown, post-COVID environment. And then there is something which is in a way longer term, although it'll be interesting to see how much he addresses this, which is about the public finances and the state of the public finances. And that's probably where I'll devote my remarks today. I think the first question he'll have to answer is what is the scale of the challenge? Rupert has talked about 40 billion or so. It might be less, it might be more. I think there is going to be clearly a substantial shortfall in the public finances. And I entirely agree with Rupert's point earlier. The issue isn't the huge increase in debt that we've seen over the last 12 months or so. The problem is going to be the recurring deficit, a few years down the line, where the OBR is saying we're still going to be borrowing £100 billion a year. That's a pretty hefty sum of money. I say that in terms of accepting a debt to GDP ratio of around about 100%, not without a degree of queasiness. I'm always slightly suspicious of arguments that this time is different. It does leave us not terribly well prepared if we were to run into future difficulties. But I think it is clear that we're in a different set of circumstances from where we were when Rupert and I joined the Treasury in 2010. Debt interest rates are low. There isn't a difficulty at the moment in terms of getting our debt away, partly because of the role of central banks, and the risk of a sovereign debt crisis isn't really within sight. So we are in a different set of circumstances, but even accepting that, the idea that we should continue to see the state of the public finances, if you like, deteriorate in terms of our debt to GDP ratio, I think is worrying. I think it's an interesting point Rupert makes about the focus on our debt interest payments. I very much would defer to Rupert on this point. I think the question, and it's a genuine question I would have, is to what extent we can be confident that we can get our debt away with a long maturity date, to ensure that if there's a problem, we have got time to adjust to it over the medium and long term. But yeah, so that's I think the scale of our challenge. Whether it's going to be 40 billion, whether it's 60 billion, whether it's a little bit less, it's nonetheless a substantial sum of money. And I do think the government does need to address that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to take action on the 3rd of March, but it certainly needs to prepare the ground. I'm not someone who thinks it would be an utter disaster for the economy for them to start taking measures. You can increase some taxes and cut other taxes. You can put permanent tax increases in and temporary tax cuts. There's all sorts of things that could be done, and in the great scheme of things, discretionary fiscal measures that run to to £4 or £5 billion, say, is not going to have that dramatic effect upon the economic recovery. But nor is there absolute urgency here to take action. The markets don't need to be reassured. So I think it's perfectly reasonable just to sort of start to set out a plan at this point, perhaps with a view of some kind of fiscal consolidation beginning 2022, 23, maybe even later, even after that. Where is he going to go? Well, spending is already pretty tight, as again has been mentioned earlier. If you look at current spending, it's pretty tight. I'm not sure they'll get all the capital spending that they've got planned out the door. I think that's really ambitious, but you can't base your fiscal policy on failing to deliver your capital spending policy. So I don't think he can pray that in aid. And that does bring you to tax. Now, so this is where I think I'll try to inject a bit of disagreement and controversy into our session this afternoon. I think he probably will go for corporation tax. I think he will increase the rate of corporation tax, whether it's to 23% or whether that's slightly pitch rolling and it'll end up being 21. I think it probably will go up. I think it's a pity. There were good reasons why, when George was Chancellor, we went for corporation tax and low rates there. Corporation tax is essentially a tax on investment returns. If you reduce the rate of return on your investment, I think all other things being equal, you will get less investment. I don't think it's particularly economically efficient. I think if you can make that part of your offer, part of what the UK is about, then I think there are big advantages to it. But what I would say, I spent quite a lot of time in that period talking to businesses internationally, spent quite a lot of time going to the States, trying to persuade businesses to invest in the UK. They've been very impressed by what we've done. But you were faced with the question of, look, there are some jurisdictions that have got a really long-standing record on being competitive on corporation tax. Republic of Ireland, Luxembourg, Switzerland used to get mentioned. We really need to see it. You need to demonstrate this over a long period of time. And then we're likely to respond to it. And the concern was, well, the UK is new at being competitive on corporation tax. Is it sustainable? And I think, to be fair to those businesses that were making that point, they can probably argue that actually we couldn't sustain it. And we didn't get the investment in this country after 2016 that we might have done, for frankly, due to the referendum result. And now we haven't delivered on the 17% rate. It's been reversed to 19%. And so perhaps to argue against myself, given that we have failed to make a thing of corporation tax and really be committed to it as a policy, then look, if we're not going to be ahead of the pack, then you could argue maybe we fall back into the pack. And at 23%, we're still in the pack. But I do think it's a missed opportunity. I do think that this is an economically inefficient tax. And if the UK could have differentiated itself on that tax, then that would have been no bad things. So where else does he raise the money from? I mean, there are ideas going around about excessive profits taxes and online sales taxes, and they might well go down that route. Maybe we'll talk about those in details. I think there are some significant downsides with both of them, and I don't think they're going to raise vast sums of money, whatever happens. CGT, again, there's been a lot of pitch rolling. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point, probably not on the 3rd of March, perhaps more likely in a second fiscal event this year in November, that we see CGT rates go up. I don't think you can raise vast sums of money here. And I think the idea that you try and equalize the rate with income tax, I think you'll be beyond the revenue maximizing point quite comfortably if you were to do that. So I don't see that as a runner, but you probably could increase rates a bit and raise a little bit more revenue. I think the really big challenge he's got, if he wants to raise substantial sums of money, you need to use the big levers. We get 64% of government revenue from income tax, national insurance contributions, and VAT. Obviously, there is the issue of the Manifesto Commitment. I personally think, and I speak as someone who's not a member of the Conservative Party, I don't think this government could be criticised if it were to say, well, we set out that policy in good faith at the last general election, but circumstances have so dramatically changed. We need to raise additional revenue, and we can do this in a way that is progressive, which is what you can do with taxes on income, and we can do this in a way that is economically efficient, which you can also do using VAT. And I think, in the end, and I don't think necessarily the government or the Conservative Parliamentary Party is ready for this yet, but in the end, they're going to have to say, I'm sorry, we just can't responsibly maintain that manifesto commitment. They might try and find ways around it. There's Rupert and I's former our permanent secretary, Nick McPherson's arguing for a solidarity tax, which is, if you like, another tax on income, but hypothecated, supporting the NHS. That might be one way of doing it. If you wanted a really radical reform, I think it's quite an interesting idea, but I don't see us pursuing anytime particularly soon, it would be a progressive consumption tax. I think is a really interesting idea, but that and possibly you get the best of both worlds there. But I do think ultimately you're going to have to use those big levers, and unless and until the government is prepared to face up to that, what is admittedly a very difficult choice, it's hard to see how you will get the fiscal consolidation, the tax rises that are necessary, so that we don't see us with a further deterioration in our public finances.
David, thank you. A lot for us to chew on in the forthcoming discussion there. So we've started to get some questions and comments kind of pour into the Q&A function. Before I turn to those, I think your way, both Rupert and David, you kind of separated your comments into the kind of short term, in David's case, the medium term and the long term, but just to separate them into the kind of immediate and the slightly longer term questions for a moment. I thought we could start by talking about this immediate question of how do you bridge to the future? How do you bridge to that second half of the year, where it seems like all of you are broadly in agreement that it's likely we're going to have some kind of quite significant rebound in the economy and hopefully a kind of a significant uplift in terms of economic activity and investment. But how do we get there? And I'm really interested in the politics of this, because we've had a really sustained campaign on universal credit to try and not just increase the length of that support package, that £1,000 a year, but also to make it permanent. I mean, the campaign is ultimately about trying to kind of create a permanent uplift in universal credit. We've also seen at various points over the last year calls for sector-specific subsidies or sector-specific grants in order to support specific businesses. And even from the lockdown plan announced yesterday, it was clear that in July and August, there are still going to be some sectors, I think of the kind of large events business or the kind of hospitality sector, who may still be quite significantly restricted in different ways, whether that's from vaccine passports or kind of questions about mass gatherings. To what extent do you think the government is going to struggle to deliver on a kind of universal plan for kind of phasing out that support that really, I mean, do you think we're still going to have some levels of pandemic support in 6 months or 12 months time, for example? And if so, which types of support do you think the Chancellor will be least able to phase out over that kind of short-term period? And if I could perhaps start with Lizzie, rather than letting Rupert go first every time, I'm going to start with Lizzie and then come to Rupert and then David, if that's all right. Lizzie. You're on mute, I think.
That's it. So you asked about sectors still being restricted. So we've had the announcement of the roadmap to recovery. You've got non-essential shops opening April 12th at the earliest, but then pubs and restaurants being only outside at that date open, and then being fully open not till May. So you've got the hospitality sector calling for that extra support. I can't see that going away until they're fully back up and running. You asked how much the government will struggle to deliver a universal plan. I think, say with the furlough scheme being tapered out, I think it's to not focus on the longer term and on job creation, to not narrow it down as the IFS is suggesting, to be more targeted, looking at sectors and regions. I just don't see that. I don't see it not being more targeted in the future. Do I think there'll still be pandemic support in the next 6 months? Yes. If that was certainly the tone of Boris Johnson's speech yesterday, they're not going to pull the rug out from jobs and livelihoods. And Rishi Sunak's last budget was a whatever it takes budget. So I can't see the tone of that changing as the unlockdown is all about caution. I don't think that they're going to treat business in a different way to that.
Thank you, Lizzie. Rupert, what's your view?
Yeah, look, I agree. I think that, having come this far, I think it would be a sort of penny pinching and unwise to sort of withdraw support too soon. But I think that they are going to be very keen to try and get rid of as much as possible of it by the second half of the year. So I think that, you keep the furlough largely in place. We've seen before that there are things they can do to taper the generosity as things get back up and running, and I think that will be the story through kind of May and June. When you talk about, the Treasury will be very, very reluctant to get into sector-specific support, and it's always very, very difficult because of the definitions and the boundaries around these sectors and who is eligible, and you create some unintended distortions around that and some weird incentives. Much depends on how the virus data evolves. So if we are able to get the case numbers down enough, and if the vaccines prove to be resilient enough against new variants, and if we are able to roll out boosters and updated vaccines, then I think if you can get the vast majority of life back to normal, then you can just take things away. And maybe very, very small parts of the economy, like, for example, very large scale events, there'll be a few venues, for example, that then the Treasury might have the capacity to engage with on a sort of almost a discretionary basis. But I think that's probably the limit. I would aim to sort of try and take everything away and then get back to the sort of universally available policies that are available through, like, training, job support, hiring incentives and things like that. So I think that will be the aim, but of course it will depend on how successful the virus kind of and vaccine effect is. And if we get into a second wave into the winter, then we know what policy tools will be turned back on. Universal credit is a very, very difficult one. I think it's very, very hard to take money away from people, and particularly people on low incomes for whom it has a very important contribution to living standards through this period. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to have a nominal cut in the incomes of that group. At the same time, I think kind of making a 6 billion increase in welfare spending permanent when you've got a pretty big hole in the public finances is also very difficult. I mean, I would try and just freeze it in nominal terms and let it erode over time. And I know that one of the objections to that is that might take a decade. Well, so what? That's fine. If you're worried about the kind of long-term state of the public finances, that's what I would do. I think the UC system can probably handle that. You just have smaller increases over time until you're back to the trajectory you would have been on had you not done this increase. I think taking the money away would be very, very difficult, personally.
Okay, thank you. And David, what's your view on this?
I think the first point to make is we have to remember that when it comes to the support that is provided, that ultimately really it's not the Treasury that is in charge here. It is the virus and the vaccine. It's the health situation that is the dominant thing. And I'm generally in favour of the Treasury being in charge. But I think there were some problems in the autumn where the Treasury said, well, this is what we need to be doing. And in fact, it's just all too dependent upon what's happening with the virus. Is the first point to say. I think the second point is for the reason that Rupert sets out. There are problems with doing support on a sector by sector basis. There's an additional problem, which is, look, as we come through this, to some extent, the furlough system which has been a very, very good thing, and I'm grateful to Rupert's kind remarks earlier about why it all depended upon PAYE reform, but it's helped freeze the economy in the structure that it was in February 2020. And the point at which we come out, the consumer preferences, consumer demands are going to be different. And as an economy, we have got to respond to that. We have got to, our employment market has got to reflect our consumer preferences. And you can't lock people into things that are no longer needed or necessary. And that's why it's a really tricky thing, because that's quite a hard message to say, sorry, we're not supporting your job anymore. We'll support you, but we're not supporting your job anymore. But if we want people to be doing things that are productive, we've got to allow a shift, our employment market, our labour market, to shift in response to how consumers are going to behave in future. I don't know precisely how they're going to behave, but we can be pretty sure it's going to be different to the way that consumers were behaving in February 2020. So that's why I think sort of sectoral response is probably not the right thing. As for universal credit, I think Rupert makes a good case just for freezing it. One thing I feel slightly uneasy about is, look, if you can see why they did the uplift as a way of providing additional support, and that was the right thing to do. But if you were sitting back and saying, let's imagine we've got £6 billion to put into the universal credit system, and we've got time to work out how to do it, we wouldn't have done it that way. Whether it would have been looking at work allowances, whether it had been looking at the taper rate, we would have done things differently. But there would obviously be a political, even if you got the money, there would still be a political price to pay and say, actually, hold on, we can spend this money better, because you'll have winners and losers, and we know where the political pain will come from. So the sort of the idea of letting that uplift wither on the vine may well be the politically sensible thing to do.
Just to be clear, David, you're not proposing that they should switch that 6 billion into another form of universal credit reform, for example, reforming work allowances or shifting the taper rate. You're just essentially saying it's difficult to take money away from people.
I'm making that point. I mean, I think partly reflecting the fact that we're going to have higher unemployment. And even though we are a poorer economy than we were in the past, actually, I can see a very good moral case because of the way that the pandemic has affected people differently, for a more redistributive approach than we had before, and therefore increasing our spending on universal credit. But if you were to do this purely on good policy, what you would do is not maintain the £6 billion uplift. You would probably spend that in a slightly different way. I wouldn't be averse to doing that, but I'd still accept there's some political pain in doing that, even though that would be a better policy.
Very good, thank you. So there are a few questions, and I want to, in a moment, come on to the question of kind of green taxes and the green industrial revolution, which is kind of dominating the question and answer session. But just very quickly before we come on to that, I just want to touch on something which is very close to Onward's heart, which is the kind of distribution of the recovery, as it were, the geographic kind of disparities within our economy, and whether or not we should be worried about the recovery being increasingly concentrated in some places. Rupert, you mentioned the savings rate and the kind of dry powder on company balance sheets. I think it's fair to say that will be overwhelmingly based in London and the southeast, or at least or to some degree. The saving rates in London tends to be about double, or a bit more than double, in London than elsewhere. Should we be worried about that, or should we be bluntly grateful for the recovery and keen to kind of drive jobs and investment wherever it is? And I might start with David, if that's all right, and then come to Rupert and then Lizzie.
Look, I think we're going to face some enormous challenges just getting us sort of going as a whole. I worry a little bit that our political debate is becoming quite hostile to London, and London makes a huge contribution economically to the rest of the United Kingdom. I think the ways in which we can ensure that the whole of the UK can grow are mostly pretty long-term challenges, and the fact that London probably will bounce back quicker, or at least the greater southeast of England will probably bounce back quicker. But I think London's going to face its own challenges. People not going into the centre of London in the same way, that you can start to sort of locate elsewhere. I mean, it's not, there are some considerable uncertainties for London as well as an economy. So look, I mean, I think the levelling up agenda is important, but fundamentally that is going to be about the long term, and that's going to be about infrastructure and skills and training and so on. The immediate issue is to get the economy moving.
Rupert?
Yeah, look, I would agree that I don't think that it's not clear to me that I haven't seen good data on the idea that the pandemic itself is going to worsen these geographical inequalities. In fact, in some ways, as David mentioned, I think it could actually harm London more than other areas, because I think that this move to remote working and more dispersed sort of options for where you want to live is obviously going to hurt the areas with the highest cost of living and the highest house prices the most, because the incentive to get out of London is a lot higher than the incentive to get out of anywhere else. So I think that London is probably going to have to cope with quite a big adjustment to the pattern of living, demand and travel, and that'll be a challenge for a lot of businesses and the people they employ in London. Equally, I think that creates opportunities for a lot of other areas. I think the sort of new economic geography post-pandemic means that there are new growth strategies available to areas of the country that they didn't have before, based on attracting remote and knowledge-based workers who can work from home, who might, for example, need to travel into a hub once a week, once a month, but otherwise have a lot more choice to choose where they live on the basis of kind of living costs, attractive countryside, or nice cultural centres, good schools. All these things are suddenly going to be, we're going to get a big shakeout in economic geography, I think. But so I think that the UK has a huge pre-existing regional issue and an issue about kind of unequal distribution of wealth creation and skills and infrastructure and things like that. I think that already was a huge issue. It's very, very top of mind for the government. I think the pandemic, in a way, kind of creates new opportunities to address that.
Okay, thank you. Lizzie, do you have a view on the kind of levelling up agenda and whether or not it butts up against some of the pandemic reality?
Yeah, I mean, the last time I was on an Onward panel was about levelling up, and you can hear I'm Northern, so I obviously don't want that agenda to go away. It's a shame that the pandemic seems to have, kind of distracted a bit of necessarily the Treasury's attention from that agenda. I'd back up the point that London itself is struggling. There was the IFS data that showed that London lost the most jobs of the UK regions in the pandemic last year. Not to forget but the potential, we don't know how bad it'll be, Brexit impact the city of London. So I don't think that London should be forgotten in the levelling up agenda. I just think that the levelling up agenda needs to stay on the agenda.
Thanks, Lizzie. So I now want to turn to the kind of some of the meaty and more controversial element of the discussion, which is kind of taxes, I guess. And we've had 3 or 4 different questions or comments in the Q&A, specifically about green taxes. We've obviously got COP later this year. We've got the UK using its leadership of or chairmanship of the G7 this year, also to drive the environmental agenda, and a kind of growing sense that now might finally be the time that the international community comes together on kind of potential international kind of border carbon tax, carbon adjustments, and that the UK may start to seed the way for some more direct taxation around carbon specifically. So we've had questions from Will DePayer, Graham Macmillan, and indeed Phil Aldrich from the Times. And so I'm just going to pose Phil's question, because I think it captures the sense of both the other questions too, which is, what do you think the Chancellor will do on the climate agenda? The EU is thinking about carbon border taxes. Should we think about the same things here? How do we take a commanding leadership on position on this ahead of COP? And is that a matter for the budget, which I guess is the focus of today's discussion? Could I start with David? You've got your microphone not on mute, so I'm going to start with you in the hope that you were inviting that, and then I'm going to move to Lizzie and then Rupert.
Failing to mute between answers, I didn't realise was an indication of volunteering, but there you go. It strikes me, listening to what the Chancellor says, is that he does perhaps relatively unusually for a Chancellor. He is sort of wanting to own the green agenda. He sees this as being important. Clearly, tax is going to play a significant role on this. One issue is fuel duty, which has been politically really, really difficult for the government for the last 10 years. Every time it's been mooted that it should go up. Rob Halfon and the Sun tell governments not to do so, and by and large governments act accordingly. But I think that probably the time has come to at least end the freeze on fuel duty. But that comes with political costs. That's probably not going to be popular with a lot of people, and in a lot of the people who the Conservatives won over at the last general election. If you're looking at an area where if you were going to increase carbon taxes, we, by the standards of everything else we tax, we undertax domestic fuel. But governments have got a pretty horrible history when trying to tax domestic fuel. I can just about remember my political activism began pretty well at the same time that the government was hugely unpopular over attempts to put VAT on domestic fuel. So, that's immensely difficult. And I mean, in short, do I think the Chancellor will want to do some stuff on this? Yes, but it is politically challenging because people, that is more tax and people will have to pay it, and it will be very obvious that they're paying more tax, and that I think will not land easily with everyone.
Me?
Yes, Lizzie, please.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It is a hugely politically sensitive issue to raise fuel duty. I said earlier about the higher oil prices already hitting the pumps, it hit hauliers. But then if you think about electric vehicles going forward, if fossil fuel based vehicles are being phased out, it probably won't help much anyway. That's SEBA's argument. They may have to turn to road tolls, but I think this question, the broader question about green taxes, isn't going to be the top of the agenda in this budget. It's definitely going to be a focus on jobs and emergency support.
Rupert.
No, I agree. I think the whole government, and including Rishi Sunak, wants to be seen to be leading on the green agenda because that's a huge part of the sort of political platform and because of COP. So I think there will be, I think the sort of easiest place to take this is as part of the also the G7 presidency and focus it as a sort of international thing. I think border adjustment taxes are, so this free trader in me kind of slightly hates them because I'm sure that they will be used in practice as a vehicle for protectionism, and that's certainly, you can see there are some elements within the European Union who kind of can't wait to get their hands on this new way of basically taxing imports. But intellectually, if you are serious about trying to avoid just sort of exporting carbon emissions elsewhere in the world, then there's a very strong case. And so if the UK can, I think Rishi Sunak may well seek to sort of position himself as a kind of leader of an international debate on things like that. It's true. Like, if you were really serious about trying to level up the price of carbon in the economy, it's the places where it's low are low because it's politically very difficult to do something about it, and that is fuel and home heating. And I just think that that's going to be very, very difficult. And therefore, in most areas, probably border adjustment tax is the exception. The path of least resistance of the green agenda is higher spending, i.e. like subsidizing new technologies. The government set out pretty ambitious plans around renewables, a hydrogen economy, carbon capture and storage, but there isn't as yet a huge amount of money attached to some of these things, and I think that therefore you might see a bit more on that front, particularly around things like hydrogen, because I think at the best of times, and particularly now, as Lizzie said, hiking fuel duty. I mean, look, I think the brave thing to do would be to end the freeze on fuel duty, definitely, and I'd be supportive of that, and I'd be impressed if Rishi Sunak chooses to do that. But there will be a lot of political noise about it.
Yes, indeed. It was very notable, I thought, that the Sun newspaper has launched its kind of road to COP campaign, kind of marrying kind of consumer-friendly climate policies alongside its existing fuel duty campaign, which they're continuing to do. So fuel duty will continue to be a political football, I'm sure. So there seems to be kind of relative agreement there that while carbon taxes may be something to be considered in the future, they will be probably largely confined to some of the international debates, and certainly in the immediate term, unlikely to come in this budget or be talked about. So I suppose the question then becomes where else do you raise taxes? And Rupert, you talked about personal allowance freeze and corporation tax to 23%. Those two things together, I think, would raise about £18 billion a year by the end of the Parliament. That still leaves a fair old gap by most people's standards in terms of filling the kind of budget hole. Are there other areas where you would kind of, I know you've all spoken about this to some degree in your remarks, but I guess the kind of question is, where else should the Chancellor be looking? We've had a few comments in the Q&A about, for example, should he be looking at reducing the generosity of certain tax reliefs like business property relief, business asset disposal relief? He's already done some things on the latter of those. Should he be kind of in the other direction, extending stamp duty, or should he be using the kind of reimposition of stamp duty in order to kind of regain some revenue for the Exchequer? Can I ask all of you to come in on this question about exactly where the Chancellor should try and fill that hole? We've obviously talked about this a fair bit already, but we're kind of interested in kind of getting down to the nitty-gritty about where he might find 22 billion, for example, by the end of the Parliament if he is trying to fill that hole. So, Lizzie, could I potentially start with you? Kind of interested in your views where, I mean, journalistically, where exactly the pressure is going to come on him, and where he might be able to make an argument that now is the time to kind of find revenue from some more controversial taxes, perhaps.
Well, yeah. So we've talked about the corporation tax. That would be, politically easy place to start. You mentioned the stamp duty holiday. I don't see it being extended for or made permanent. So when that ends, you'll save a bit. I don't see, as I said, I don't see an increase in fuel duty. I don't see the equalisation of capital gains tax with income tax bands. So it is very, very difficult. It would be shocking if they started playing with VAT, income tax, national insurance. So it's a very, very difficult question. What's actually there's a question in the chat about whether I think it'll come from one big tax or whether it'll be tinkering around the edges, and I think it'll be a combination of tinkering around the edges.
David, is that your view? Do you think he'll make up the big chunk left over through a series of small taxes, or potentially new taxes like online sales taxes, which bring in a little bit, like 2 or 3 billion a year?
I think there's every chance that that's what he'll try to do. I think it would be a pity. I think in part because there's more complexity for the tax system. I'm not sure it'll work trying to find this off lots of little taxes. I think there'll be some unintended consequences of that. And I am slightly reminded, and at the risk of reminding Rupert of myself of the trauma of 2012, is that lots of little taxes, and let's face it, they're not going to be that little, because if they're not raising billions, then they're not really making much of a contribution. But lots of little tax increases can be a lot harder than one big tax increase. And our experience of increasing VAT, which took effect at the beginning of 2011. I mean, okay, there was a heck of a lot of pitch rolling on that, but that went relatively easy, raising, depending on how you looked at it, I think 12 billion pounds or so. Trying to find 150 million pounds on VAT on pasties, and the sky fell in. So I think if you're trying to, get serious sums of money, you have to use the big, broad-based taxes, and that's where you run into the manifesto commitment. But I just don't see how you can plug the hole without using those big taxes.
Rupert, do you look back on 2012 with great fondness?
Well, I do, in the sense that in retrospect, it was the beginning of the recovery, because we had, funded for lending Mario Draghi and the end of the Eurozone crisis, and that was the beginning of the better times. But no, the budget was pretty disastrous. But and I think for the reasons that David, we were trying to, you've got to remember why that happened, in the sense that you were scrabbling for revenue to try and pay for an enormous increase in the personal allowance, which was the sort of quid pro quo for cutting the top rate of tax from 50 to 45, which was something that George Osborne really wanted to do. And yeah, there were just too many things in there that were not well thought through enough and too vulnerable to kind of campaigns against them. I think it is possible to kind of thread the needle between, I think you can avoid breaking the manifesto commitment and still raise a significant amount of tax. I think I would definitely do corporation tax, maybe up to 23, 24. It's a big chunk of money. I think the sort of freezing thresholds and allowances is not a bad thing to do. We know that freezing things is a lot easier than raising rates. It accrues gradually. I think the great benefit of doing a big chunk on tax now is that if you discover that, as David said, you can fine tune the macro impact by cutting taxes temporarily up front or spending temporarily, but what you've got in the bank is the permanent increase that is what kind of hits your bottom line back in sort of 23, 24, 25. And if you've done too much, you remember there's a political cycle as well as an economic cycle. If you find that you've done too much on tax, you can always give some back in 2024, which might be quite well timed. So I would do allowances, thresholds, corporation tax. Capital gains tax, as David said, is a tricky one. So when we were shown modelling back in 2010, as the coalition government came into government, the revenue maximising rate of capital gains tax, as calculated by HMRC then, was 28%. And so raising it above that loses you money. I think you could probably increase that if it's part of a bigger overall reform, because one of the problems is that you raise it much above 28 and you start losing, you get leakage out of other bits of the tax system. So you would have to go after things like capital gains tax at death, some of the inheritance tax issues. And so if you're going to do a kind of broader radical reform of capital taxation, then you probably can push those capital gains tax rates up a bit. But that's a very big risky reform that you need to get, number 10 and the Conservative Party on board for. But I think that there is some serious money if you are willing to do that. I think we should long have gone after some of the inheritance tax reliefs around business property, agricultural property. There isn't a huge amount of money, but they start to add up. And then when you add in a few other things like online sales taxes and some of the sort of newer things that, I think you end up with a pretty chunky number that's sort of north of 20 maybe. The other one that I've always liked is to do a flat rate of pension tax relief. Now it's pretty complicated in some areas, but it has a lot of attractive sort of design aspects. You're really sort of subsidizing saving amongst the sort of lower income or middle to lower income groups who aren't saving enough. But at the same time, you could design that in a way that raised, again, some pretty chunky single figure billions. But again, that is a tax rise on 5-6 million high rate taxpayers. So again, you've got to get Conservative MPs to go through the lobbies and vote for it. So it's risky. Yeah,
indeed. And the politics of this are very, very hard. So I'm going to just return to the Q&A, because we've had a few questions, including from an anonymous attendee, about the opposite of taxes, which is kind of reliefs and subsidies in different ways. So people asking whether or not we should, perhaps at the same time as raising overall rates, be making some capital allowances, R&D tax credits more generous in order to incentivize certain types of activity. Onward in the past has argued pretty vociferously for increasing capital allowances in order to increase business investment, something that would be regionally progressive. I wonder whether or not the panel believes that this is a time to be doing some of those changes, whether the budget should include some of those steps in order to encourage some of the growth and the recovery that we want in the second half of this year, perhaps also to attract business investment. Lots of businesses that we've spoken to would say that actually allowances are in some ways as important, if not more important, than the headline top rate of corporation tax. Kind of what's the panel's view on that? Is there a case for being generous with one hand at the same time as raising some taxes with the other? Perhaps I might start with David on this one, if that's all right.
Well, let's put it this way: if we were to be putting up corporation tax rates, which for the reasons I set out earlier, I think would be a pity. But if you wanted to kind of get the profile of it right, then you could temporarily increase capital allowances, for example. You could make that more generous. I'm not a huge enthusiast for that as an overall package, and I think one of the things that I think in my time in the Treasury we were perhaps guilty of is there was a little bit sort of stop-start with the investment allowance, and we increased it one year and then cut it another, then increased it, and so on. And so stability and certainty and temporary reliefs aren't all that great, but you can make an argument in the particular circumstances that we're in at the moment that there's a case for it. And as I say, it to some extent mitigates some of the downside, as I see it, of increasing corporation tax rates. And if he is going to increase rates, then I would expect him to increase capital allowances at the same time, because again, comes back to the profile. You'll have the fiscal benefit later on in the Parliament, but it's all baked in. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see a bit of that.
Lizzie, have you got a view on R&D and capital allowances?
I really wouldn't add much. I do think that it's an important time to. I mean, if as David says, if you're going to slap them with a higher rate of corporation tax, then you do need to encourage smaller firms, especially, to be investing in technology, retraining, green growth. But I really don't have much more to add than David said.
Rupert.
Yeah, look, I think there's a case for permanently higher capital allowances, particularly for smaller companies, and I think the R&D tax credit I've always thought was a good thing and is well targeted and well designed. I wouldn't make it broader, but I would make it more generous if you're really serious about sort of trying to increase the overall, meet that target of overall UK R&D spending. And look, as well as being good policy, I think it helps if you're going to take a big chunk of money away through a rate increase, to give a small proportion of that back, to give you a kind of story to say, well, look, what we're also doing is, redirecting support towards investment and science. Yeah, I think that's probably sensible and probably what it will do.
Okay, very good. So I might now turn to the politics of all of this, which is and look explicitly to the long term. So thinking about kind of 2023, 2024, we have one question about the kind of the political difficulty, perhaps, of consolidating the fiscal position as you approach an election. And I'd like to specifically just link this to Labour, who we haven't spoken about at all during this session yet, but where I suppose there is a kind of increasing debate about where the Conservatives position themselves, where the dividing lines are between Labour and the Conservatives approaching the next election, and what is the message that the Chancellor will want to be sending to the electorate ahead of the next election about his control of the public finances and the efforts that he's made to sustain the recovery. I guess the kind of question is, kind of what position do you think the Chancellor will want to be presenting going into 2024? What are the key kind of elements that he'll want to set out as the kind of distinctive Conservative position on both the economy and the public finances? And how do you think that will differ from Labour? Because Keir Starmer in recent weeks, and Annalise Dodds as well, have been at pains to present Labour as being on the side of and in partnership with, using explicitly that word partnership with business, very kind of Mandelson, kind of 1997, 98. What is going to be the core dividing line between the Conservatives and Labour in 2024? And to what extent do you think that's going to be a sustainable position, given what the fiscal position is likely to look like at that stage, where we quite possibly will still have a large hangover of pandemic debt and possibly a recovery that is, even if the second half of this year and next year are kind of burgeoning, we're still making up some of the lost ground perhaps of the last year or so. So if I could perhaps start with David on this, and then Rupert, and then Lizzie.
I think from everything that we've seen and heard from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi will want to ensure that the Conservatives go into the next general election as being seen as more fiscally conservative, more fiscally cautious than the Labour Party. And it's all kind of relative. If you look at the last general election, I don't think the Conservative Party were terribly fiscally conservative, but they were still more fiscally conservative than Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell. And the Conservatives have done well in the last 4 general elections by marking out that territory. So I think they will want to position themselves as being a bit more fiscally conservative than the Labour Party. I think Keir Starmer will be aware of that, and I think he'll want to close that debate down. And there's sort of some signs they're sort of moving in that direction. The academic and the intellectual economic argument has moved away from fiscal conservatism over the last 10 years because circumstances have changed. But I think the British public still will be wary of people who don't look as if they're credible on this issue. And so I think it will still be a matter. I think one thing that probably Rishi needs to be a little bit careful of is that, you know, sometimes he makes these arguments to Conservative MPs and then it gets reported back to people like Lizzie, and it all comes across a little bit too much as being political positioning. You know, you've got to make sure that you're making this argument because not because it's politically convenient, but because you really believe in it. But yeah, the other thing I would say, and this is where it's got perhaps a little bit more difficult for the Conservative Party, is that, you know, they fought and won the last general election by and large united on the issue of getting Brexit done. It's a pretty diverse and disparate set of views within the parliamentary party and amongst Conservative supporters. So that's a little bit harder. You know, it's not relying on the fiscally conservative, relatively small state, low tax electorate in the way that perhaps was the case in 2010 and 2015. It's got a different electorate. But I think that's probably more of an acute issue on the size of the state rather than necessarily on how much you borrow. But it's not as coherent an electorate, if you like, and indeed parliamentary party, as was in the case in the past.
Indeed, and that actually there's been some very interesting qualitative research recently by James Johnson and others, which shows that despite the fact that red wall voters are kind of more open to a larger state and higher tax and spend, there is a very strong sense, I understand, within those groups that the money from the pandemic needs to be paid back. So it may be a kind of moral or kind of virtuous point rather than just a purely fiscal one, I think, perhaps within some of those voter groups. Rupert, what's your view on this and the politics of the next election with regard to the economy and the fiscal position?
I mean, I think that it's too early to get specific because it's still, you know, at least 3 years away, and you know, a lot can change. But I think, yeah, some big lessons that are almost always true. Like I think the Conservative Party will always run on being sort of a responsible steward of the economy. The public finance will be part of that. I definitely agree that that's kind of less of a priority now, both because the sort of intellectual climate has changed and because of the nature of the electoral coalition. But I also think that I don't think Keir Starmer is doing enough to move the Labour Party sufficiently to make that very difficult for the Conservative Party. I think there will still be a very kind of broad bit of territory for them to occupy that is still responsible relative to the Labour Party, but actually not politically very difficult and won't require them to impose huge amounts of pain in order to pose as responsible. And then, you know, much more importantly, will be a Conservative Chancellor going into an election as usual saying we've got a strong economy, we've delivered on jobs, we've got a plan that's working. You know, those are the things that tend to work for kind of Conservative re-election campaigns when you haven't got a kind of big cross-cutting issue like Brexit, like we did in 2019. I think the kind of the main lesson, as always with the political cycle, is kind of if you are going to have to take some pain, take it early. And I think that sort of again reiterates the case for sort of doing difficult things now, while profiling the overall macro impact, but getting some money in the bank that will show up later on. And then if you can give it back, as I say, then that's great. At least even if you can't give it back, at least it will have faded from the sort of political memory by the time you come to an election. And then, you know, you've got to have a plan that is based around the key deliverables, which is around creating jobs. And I think this levelling up agenda is going to be hugely important in the election because of the nature of the seats that the Conservatives will be defending, and therefore looking for kind of tangible evidence of that. You know, you want to, I bet that they are already starting to think there is someone in number 10 and certainly a Conservative Party headquarters with a map of those seats and which projects are going to get funded between now and then that they can go and visit and make a big deal about in local press and national press. And, you know, look, like that. And ideally, that wouldn't be how project selection happens when you're looking about a kind of big infrastructure, but that is always a consideration. And so I think being able to turn out, even if things aren't fully built or done, like to being able to say, look, we talked about leveling up, we were serious, here are the deliverables. It's, if you want to, you almost want them to be only halfway through, because if you want to stick with this agenda, stick with us. That will absolutely be, I think, the message.
Indeed. You reminded me of a conversation I had with a Conservative MP who ran in 2015 on getting a motorway or a bypass approved, ran in 2017 on getting it approved, and ran on the kind of the fact that he had got it approved, and ran in 2019 on the fact that construction had already started, and that was essentially the winning issue for him.
The gift that kept on giving.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Very good. Lizzie, I'm going to come to you for a kind of final word, as we're going to treat this as the final word, but to kind of talk us through what you think the politics and the economics of the next general election might be.
Well, I think Keir Starmer is really in a difficult position, given how generous the government's been in its spending. He's agreeing that the public and the private sector need to work together. The speech that he made the other day was kind of a bit of a, I think, universally seen by the commentariat as a flop. It was at least overhyped. A lot of people were saying that the recovery bonds idea was not original. Him trying to say that Labour's going to have a strong relationship with business is tough. He's got a tough job to turn around the reputation. But Labour, the Conservatives need to show that they are fiscally responsible. The Conservatives need to show that they can do this smart spending, and these are, buttons that Keir Starmer's pressing, and they've got time. They've got an opportunity to do that. It's, if, as Rupert says, the election's a long way away, and so if they can turn it around by then this is very, very early days to be asking these questions. But I don't cover politics, so it's really not my area of expertise.
Well, thank you very much for answering it anyway, Lizzie, and and thank you so much to all of our panelists. I mean, it feels like it's very interesting, because it feels like just 6 months ago there was a lot more uncertainty in this debate than there is now. As we've approached this budget, there's been a consolidation, I think, of commentary around both a need to start kind of approaching and addressing the question of fiscal consolidation, and a recognition that will involve tax rises, as difficult as those are for a Conservative government to accept, and as difficult politically as they are to implement. It feels like there is a kind of growing consensus. I think it feels to me like there are still some big outstanding questions about the overall level of debt and the trajectory of debt reduction that you're willing to countenance, especially given kind of appetite and views of interest rates. Some quite big questions about the kind of inflationary effects of some of the stimulus kind of support given, especially in the US, but potentially also in the UK, and what that means for that trajectory. And then also some kind of longer term questions about not just the government's appetite to increase taxes in order to pay for the pandemic, but actually the government's intention with regard to reforming the tax system in order to make it more efficient and more effective. Reminded of the fact that Rishi Sunak reportedly, his kind of hero as a Chancellor of the past is Nigel Lawson, who famously wanted to cut a tax in every budget, and kind of make the system much more effective and efficient. So it feels to me like there is probably quite a lot more mileage in this debate, and that we're still at a kind of staging post in this budget on the kind of the fiscal journey for this Parliament, just as we come out of the pandemic and the economic consequences of it, and start to look towards the recovery. So this has been an amazing discussion, a really fantastic moment for us to have it a week ahead of the budget, and we look forward to finding out how many of the ruminations and predictions made today are proved correct when the Chancellor stands up at the dispatch box next Wednesday. But thank you all everyone for tuning in. Thank you in particular to our three panelists, Rupert, David and Lizzie, for giving us their wisdom and their thoughts, and being willing to do so a week before the budget as well. It's always easier talking after the fact rather than before. And I will just end by saying that Onward is doing quite a lot of work in this space. We've got a report out later this week looking at the innovation economy and the kind of prospects for building high growth clusters around the UK rather than just in certain parts of the country. We have lots of work planned on the kind of levelling up agenda, which is our core economic theme, and we have work on net zero, the union, and repairing our social fabric as well. So if you're not in touch with our research, please do visit our website, sign up for our updates, and send us an email to get in touch. But I look forward to speaking to you and to hearing more from everyone on our panel and everyone who joined us virtually today in the future. There is a hell of a lot to do over the next 6 to 12 months, and I hope you can join us in helping to address some of the challenges before us. Thank you.